a huge portion of the conflict is fought under the Johnson administration, and it certainly has the most consequence to the Johnson administration. This certainly was not a conflict that Johnson began. It is one that he inherited. So just to review very quickly, remember Vietnam, Southeast Asia, this was an area that had been a colony of France. And then, there was an independence movement, as there were in a lot of colonies in a lot of parts of the third world following World War II. Who led that independence movement in Vietnam? Wanted above anything, just wanted independence for Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh. Yeah, so Ho Chi Minh wants independence for Vietnam and then starts warming up to what concept? Communism, which of course the United States didn't want. Starts warming up to the Soviets, starts warming up to the communists. Remember, Vietnam had also been divided at the end of World War II. Where was it divided? 17th parallel. The north portion, North Vietnam, being ruled by Ho Chi Minh, becoming communist, and the southern portion, South Vietnam, a sort of democratic government, or at least claiming to be a democratic government under Diem. That government was supported by the United States, but Diem was not very much of a democratic leader, and where we last left off with him was the United States encouraged a coup against him and the eventual assassination of Diem as he was becoming increasingly authoritarian. So this starts as far back, this goes back to Truman with first, we're going to support the French, give them financial aid and all these kind of things to fight this rebellion in Vietnam and try to help them, keep control over it. And then it escalates a little bit more. Kennedy sending more advisors at the time. The whole idea at first was we're not fighting the war for the Vietnamese, for the South Vietnamese. We are helping support that government. We are, training their troops, training their police forces, training their security forces, so they will be able to defend themselves and be able to stop the threat of North Vietnam and all of that. However, let's remind ourselves of the fact that, it wasn't really just North Vietnam the United States is fighting here, because particularly as Diem, the, one-time sort of kind of not really democratic leader of South Vietnam became more and more authoritarian, that caused more and more South Vietnamese to not support his government and to see, the communists and Ho Chi Minh as potential allies. And they start fighting there's an insurrection going on within South Vietnam itself against the government there. What do we call those insurgents? Oh, that's a general word. What do we call these particular insurgents in South Vietnam? Viet Cong. Okay, the Viet Cong. So it's not just North Vietnam. And usually when American forces are engaged in Vietnam, it is against the Viet Cong. It is South Vietnamese rebels against, or they're fighting against the American presence there that are, pro Ho Chi Minh. And more of their forces grow, the more Ho Chi Minh becomes really aggressive and authoritarian, all of that. So that's kind of who the United States' enemy really is. So again, when Johnson inherits this whole thing, he's really in quite a difficult position. Even his advisors are like, this is not a good situation. It's one of those things where they were just kind of stuck in whatever they did, or neither of the options, any of the options.
Teachers, please pardon this interruption. If you will please release basketball players that are leaving for the game at this time. Again, the basketball players that are leaving for the game, please release them at this time.
Because it's one of those, we don't want to lose, and none of these presidents before Johnson, the reason they had done what they had done is because they don't want to be the one to say they lost Vietnam. They don't want to be the one, in charge if Vietnam were to fall to communism. Also, remember that whole domino theory that had been suggesting that if Vietnam fell to communism, then what was going to happen? All of Southeast Asia, and then other parts, everybody's going to fall to communism, that this was kind of a key moment. So everybody wants to, we don't want to lose in Vietnam, but at the same time, we don't want to get involved in a big war either. So it's kind of do we get involved more, or what are we going to do? Again, Johnson doesn't want to turn this into a much bigger war, but doesn't want to lose either. And so he's sort of confronted with this, okay, do you just keep doing what we're doing? And, it just kind of keeps on dragging on and on. Or do we go all in, get more aggressive, and get done and get out of there? And ultimately, that is what he decides to do. But, of course, that is not at all what's going to happen. going back for just a second, the title of this section, the Vietnam quagmire, that's probably an unfamiliar word to a lot of you. A quagmire literally means like a bog or a swamp, okay? Something you get bogged down in that you can't get out of, and that's what Vietnam turns into. It turns into this, what was the longest war that the United States had ever been involved in, that has now been surpassed by Afghanistan, as we've been in Afghanistan now for 19 years, your whole life. But certainly one of the least successful, the only real war the United States has lost, and incredibly costly. It completely divides the country, nearly tears the country apart in some people's view. Cost Johnson his presidency is the reason why a lot of those Great Society programs that we talked about last week were not successful, because it's incredibly costly and it took away a lot of the funding that might have been used to make some of those things more funded and successful and all those kind of things. So it becomes an incredibly costly thing, least successful, costing about 58,000 American lives. And again, that had already been happening, but it is under Johnson that it is escalated, okay, made bigger. So let's talk about that escalation. When we escalate something, that means making it bigger, making it stronger. In this case, putting more troops, committing more everything, and putting more into the fight in Vietnam. That whole escalation process starts with and happens because of something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This becomes a turning point and what begins that escalation in August of 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin, body of water off of North Vietnam. And it is reported, or two American ships that were in the Gulf of Tonkin report that they had been fired on by the North Vietnamese, that the North Vietnamese guns, ships, had fired upon two American destroyers there in the Gulf of Tonkin. So they're saying they've been attacked. And so Johnson, takes this information, they describe it as an unprovoked attack. And so Johnson then is going to use this incident and take this information to Congress to say they have attacked us, it was not provoked, therefore, what have we got to do? We've got to retaliate, we've got to respond. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we will look at later, no one knows this at the time, but the details surrounding this end up being a lot more shady than that, and that really was not the entire truth of the situation, so keep that in mind. Was not exactly unprovoked. But nevertheless, Johnson goes to Congress and says, we've got to step things up in Vietnam. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident is what is used to justify increasing American involvement in Vietnam. And it leads Congress to pass, just a few days after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, without even debating it all that much, Congress will pass something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorizes the president, in this case President Johnson, to do, and the exact words are, to take all necessary measures to prevent future attacks, to prevent future aggression. Basically, giving the president what? Control of what he wants to do. Sometimes this is called the blank check. Okay, basically saying that President Johnson can do what he wants to do without congressional approval, because who has the power to declare war? Only Congress. This is bypassing that technically, which there have been, multiple military actions because the president's commander-in-chief of the military, but this is pretty much giving him authorization and permission from Congress to escalate things, to send more troops, to send more weapons, all that sort of stuff, to do whatever he sees as necessary. So what we have here is a presidential war. Which is one of the reasons why Johnson's going to get in so much trouble, so much hot water for it, is because so much of this came from here with Congress's authorization, of course, to give him those powers. Now, the Congress does still control the money. Remember that. They do have to appropriate the money, which they will do for a while. That is eventually how Nixon will be forced to cut things back, because eventually Congress will stop funding it. But this is basically giving Johnson the blank check, as we call it, to continue escalating the war. And so after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, we're going to start to see American forces deployed to Vietnam in huge numbers, thousands. Eventually, in the end, more than 3 million Americans will serve in Vietnam, of course, not all at once. Eventually, you will see, of course, the draft. You know how controversial that will get, where young men as young as 18 being sent to fight in Vietnam. There were, of course, lots of exceptions and ways people could get out of it, but nevertheless, that becomes another one of the many huge controversies of the Vietnam conflict. And this was a very, very different and a very, very difficult kind of a war to fight. The terrain is very different. The style of fighting is very different. And something that American forces, despite their superior equipment, despite their superior weaponry, despite their superior training, just were unable to ever get a handle on, and were unable to ever effectively fight against for a number of reasons. So we're going to talk just a little bit about some of those difficulties. With the Vietnam War, we won't look at specific battles or campaigns for the most part, really just one. It's the overall tactic, the overall strategy, the overall kind of difficulty that American forces found themselves in, and why this ended up being unwinnable and something that Americans just could not get a handle on. Sorry, probably that word's cut off, but I think you know what it is. This is not, the typical textbook kind of war like we've seen previously, with two armies in the field fighting these, laid out battles, and armies moving towards each other, and, offensives and flanks and all that kind of stuff like we've seen in pretty much every other war we've talked about. This is a guerrilla war. It is guerrilla warfare that the United States is trying to stand up against. That's the kind of war that the Viet Cong are fighting. They're not forming a nice uniformed army. It is guerrilla tactics. It is ambushes. It is these hit and run, pop up out of nowhere, do significant damage, and disappear before, anybody even has time to react. That's the kind of thing that they're dealing with. Also, as well as those guerrilla tactics, surprises, hit and runs, all these kind of things. The terrain itself, and it's not just the guerrilla warfare, but where it's being fought and the kind of surroundings in which American forces are having to conduct that guerrilla warfare is incredibly difficult. Because what's Vietnam like as far as its terrain, its topography, its climate? It's a jungle, okay, literally a jungle. And so, think of thick jungle foliage. You can't see that kind of stuff. You can't see where your enemy is. And part of those guerrilla tactics were, traps, digging holes in the ground and putting spikes, in those holes, and then covering it up with the brush. So when American forces walked over them, that would fall down in it and get impaled by some of those spikes, or their foot getting caught, those kind of things. Other tripwires, landmines, putting these little wires. Imagine if there was a little fishing line across the floor, you wouldn't see it. Even probably just in this room, you probably wouldn't see it very well. If it's covered up under, layers and layers of jungle brush, you're certainly not going to see it. So these tripwires that would set off explosions and landmines and all this sort of stuff. So they're fighting a kind of warfare that's just incredibly hard to fight in any situation. That's the whole point of guerrilla warfare, and that's the plan. But also when you're fighting it in this jungle terrain where you can't see things, airplanes, helicopters, they fly over, but your typical reconnaissance, doesn't work in this situation because you're looking down into just nothing but green leaves. You can't see anything. So they can't see their targets to bomb. They can't see, what they're fighting. Literally fighting an enemy over and over again they can't see. In addition to the guerrilla warfare, the difficult terrain, some of you know that the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese freedom fighters trying to fight against the American forces there, use a system of tunnels as well. That's what this diagram is showing you. There was this massive, incredibly elaborate tunnel system throughout South Vietnam. It was literally underground, a lot of the war, and some of the fighting was actually taking place there. So they kind of remind me of like little anthills. So there are multiple tunnels that go miles and miles that have multiple rooms in them to store supplies. They've got hospitals in some of those tunnels. They've got sleeping quarters. They've got other, command centers. It's an amazing network, really. But that allows them to conduct that kind of guerrilla warfare. When I talk about them literally popping up out of nowhere, they were like from a hole in the ground, quite literally, and then can disappear into those tunnel systems where they can recuperate. Some fighting actually took place in those tunnels as American forces would go in them and try to fight it out hand to hand. So it was quite difficult for all of those reasons and more. American forces also have the difficulty when I talk about fighting an enemy that you can't see. Part of that, in a literal sense, because the jungle is so thick and the terrain is so difficult, and all this, vegetation everywhere, that it's literally hard to see your enemy and that they're under the ground literally, so it's hard to see your enemy. It is also hard to see your enemy in that, how do you tell the difference between a nice, peaceful South Vietnamese villager who's trying to help you out and a Viet Cong spy? How do you tell the difference? No. You can't. Okay, there is no way to know. There is no way to know who's really on your side and no way to know who is actually your enemy. There was absolutely no way to tell the difference. And so they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see for that reason as well. The primary tactic used in a large part of the Vietnam War were what are called search and destroy missions, which means exactly what it sounds like. It means you go in looking for your enemy, in this case, villages. The Americans could hold like cities and stuff pretty well, which there are not that many cities in Vietnam. It's the countryside. That's where the Viet Cong had the stronghold, out in the country, out in the jungle, out in those areas. Like we were just talking about, that's where the Viet Cong communists had a strong hold and where it was much more difficult for American forces to get a handle on things. So the purpose of these search and destroy missions was to go in and seek out the enemy, go search for the communists in these little villages, destroy the enemy. So burn down the village, destroy everything, and then get out of there. That's kind of the idea, and that you would eventually destroy the enemy or lower their numbers, force them to give up. Well, that never works. And the other thing with that is, the United States is trying to also convince the South Vietnamese that we're the good guys, we're on your side. We're trying to protect you from the bad communists. Well, when the United States keeps going in and burning down villages and killing people, what does that make them look like? It doesn't make us look like the good guy, does it? It makes us look like the bad guy, and that causes more and more people to move to the communists, to the Viet Cong, and all of that. And then you've also got a significant population that just wants to live their life. They don't care. They just want to be independent. They just want to be left alone. They just don't want any of it, and they're not, interested in either way. So those search and destroy missions, one, are not effective. None of it's effective. Nothing ever works. Doesn't matter what they do. It never gets rid of that communist insurgency. It never dismantles their ability to fight, their capability to fight, and their will to fight. And they only further to turn the Vietnamese population against the United States. So to see the United States as an oppressor, as an intruder, and as just being violent, causing problems, and so forth. Now, again, I mentioned that they're never able to get a handle on any of this stuff. They're never able to turn the corner. They're never able to, get control over the Viet Cong, particularly out in the countryside. One of the reasons why they're unable to do that, there's plenty of reasons, but one of the ways in which that the Viet Cong were continuing their fight and putting up such a good fight was because of what was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, this was a supply chain, basically, a supply chain from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. So this is how the North Vietnamese were supplying the Viet Cong with everything that they needed to continue their fight. So weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, food, anything they need, they're going to be just flowing this stuff in to South Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is shown in this map here. The green, that's Vietnam. The blue is Ho Chi Minh Trail. And you may notice, if you look all the way to the left, it goes outside of Vietnam. So it goes through Laos and Cambodia. So that's one of the reasons why the United States couldn't put a stop to that without escalating the war further. They'd have to go in and start bombing Laos and Cambodia and invading there if they were going to put a stop to the supply chain and stop the flow of supplies into South Vietnam, which they didn't want to do. And therein lies another one of the just fundamental problems in the United States' strategy, where it was just not like, oh, they made a bad decision, but just one that they were just kind of misinformed, I guess, or underestimated things. The plan was, or even American officials realized even then, there was no way they were going to just get the Viet Cong to suddenly surrender. That was never going to happen. The point is just to keep harassing them to the point where they will want to negotiate, where they will, eventually will get everybody to the table, will wear them out to the point that they'll want to negotiate a peaceful solution. underestimating the fact that the Vietnamese were never going to do that. Ho Chi Minh was never going to do that. They would fight until the very last man. It did not matter to them, and casualties are always going to be more lopsided on the Vietnamese side, but their will to fight never gets broken, not at all. And so, again, it doesn't really matter eventually what American forces do. Vietnam, the Vietnamese, Viet Cong, we're not ever going to give up. And so it ultimately forces more difficult decisions to be made. So one of the ways that they're getting the supplies is through that Ho Chi Minh Trail, and trying to eliminate that was the purpose of Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder was a massive bombing campaign of North Vietnam. This is part of the air war. So a massive bombing campaign of North Vietnam, relentless bombing of North Vietnam, trying to eliminate their ability to supply the South Vietnam, or the Viet Cong rather, trying to stop the flow of supplies and weapons and all of that into South Vietnam. And it's a massive amount that goes on for years of all this bombing, of use of chemical weapons, inflicting huge amounts of damage. But again, it doesn't stop it. It just never does stop it. They might put a dent in it every now and again, but it never does have the effect of putting an end to that supply chain and stopping all that from happening. Speaking of the air war, there's brutality and ugliness on both sides of this conflict, but some of the some of the tools that were used, particularly in the air war, that become a part of some of this notoriousness of some of the tactics used in the Vietnam War. Operation Rolling Thunder and other air operations utilized napalm, which was a firebomb. It's explosive materials, a jelly-like material that causes massive explosions. But the thing is, as well as trying to explode or to firebomb, strategic sites that are providing supplies, that is thousands of villages, thousands of innocent people that are burned or killed, having their skin burning off of them because of those napalm and other kinds of chemical weapons. Another one that was used, one you may have heard of, was Agent Orange. Agent Orange wasn't an explosive, but an herbicide. What's an herbicide do? Kills plants. Mentioned that one of the problems they have, is when they fly over to conduct these bombing raids and such, the foliage is so thick, it's such thick jungle, they can't see anything. So airplanes would fly over spraying this Agent Orange, this herbicide, to kill the vegetation, to kill the plants and the jungle, foliage, so that they would be able to see those targets. Which, as you can guess, is not great for the environment. But the big concern with Agent Orange has since become the negative effects of that on people. That caused lots of health problems, birth defects amongst a lot of people in Vietnam. And as you may have heard it more specifically related to this country, lots and lots of Vietnam veterans that got cancer, many that died of cancer because of exposure to Agent Orange. At the time, they did not realize that those were cancer-causing agents, but there were lots of people, both American and Vietnamese, that experienced long-term health problems, like I said, defects, or died because of exposure to Agent Orange. So the war continues to escalate, and at first Americans, saw this as part of containment. We have to protect the country, the world from communism, all those kind of things. But as you can imagine, as it drags on, as more and more Americans are being sent to fight in Vietnam, as the death toll goes up, people will start to question that far more. And this is also a different kind of a war, and that this is the first war where television, was a part of people's everyday lives, where nearly everybody's got a television in their house. Some historians call this the first living room war. The first time that people are coming home and seeing actual footage of this every single night. Body counts, and literally that was a tactic of the United States government, was to report body counts. How many of them did they kill? How many of our people died today? How many of theirs? Because usually there'd be a lot more, Viet Cong that were killed than Americans. So they used that as a means of kind of manipulating to say we're winning, to say we're clearly winning. We're killing more of them than they are of us, so we're winning. And that's kind of the message that the United States government is sending for a long time. The turning point in this whole conflict comes in 1968, early 1968, January, with something called the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive, so Tet was that's the Vietnamese New Year, it's a holiday. And typically, around that time, there'd be like a ceasefire, temporary ceasefire because of the holiday. They would typically not fight. But the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese decide that will be an opportune moment to launch massive offensives against American forces. And so in January 1968, all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, there is massive assaults on South Vietnam, massive assaults on cities in South Vietnam, not just in the countryside, but the capital is attacked. The capital was Saigon. American forces lost control of Saigon for temporarily, but it was a massive, assault, a massive offensive launched by Viet Cong forces all of a sudden in January of 1968. So Americans are eventually able to retake some of those locations like Saigon and all of that, but at incredible cost. Incredible cost, huge amounts of casualties. This as 1968 becomes the deadliest year in Vietnam, and all of this, unfolding for a lot of people on television. It has a huge impact on the way people saw the war, on the public perception of the war. Because again, American officials have been painting this as we are winning. We got to fight the good fight. We got to stay in it. It's going to be fine. They're about to give up any second. That had been the line that people had been given. The Tet Offensive shattered that. The Tet Offensive showed that the United States was not winning. That the picture was not as rosy, it was not as perfect, and things were not as good as American officials seemed to be saying. It definitely seemed to contradict that whole picture. And it's just a psychological blow that American forces could be so caught off guard, that things could be going so badly. It very much showed how powerful the Viet Cong were, that yes, this was a peasant people that were not near sophisticated, but they fought and they meant to fight to the death. And so this really starts changing public opinion, and people start to question this whole thing more. People starting to question, is this really something we ought to be doing? Should we be here? Is this something that is winnable? And more Americans are starting to see this war as simply unwinnable, that there's no way that we can ever complete this, or it's not worth it anyway. And a good sort of a cultural example of the shift in public opinion comes from, and this is Walter Cronkite again, the same guy we saw announce Kennedy's death. He was, back in these days, there's only, your 2 or 3 major news networks, and he was people called him the most trusted man in America. Everybody got their news from Walter Cronkite. So here he is here. When it decides to play, there it is.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victims, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
So, what did Cronkite say there about the war? And we need to negotiate. This is going to end just in a stalemate. We're never going to win it. And this was really, these days we're used to seeing news reporters give their opinion. That was very unusual in those days to see that happen. And when Cronkite himself says there's no way we can win this thing, that our best option is going to be just to try to get out as best we can. Again, that just kind of is a symbolic, show that, American public opinion had drastically changed. Even President Johnson himself supposedly said something to the effect of, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the whole country, as far as public opinion was concerned. So that accompanied with all other, and there were all kinds of unrest by this point. Many of you know, we're going to look at some of that later. Protests against the war from students from different groups. 1968 in and of itself was an ugly time. And it's also a presidential election year. Sound familiar? It should. And so a few months after the Tet Offensive, Johnson goes on TV and shocks everybody with this.
Throughout my entire
Oh wait, that's not what I
public
want. I want it over here.
suspicion and distrust concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. With America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price.
So what did Johnson shock everybody with? What did he say?
He wasn't gonna run
He's not going to run again. So this, when I said this cost Johnson his presidency, the division and the fall in his popularity because of that Tet Offensive causes Johnson's popularity numbers to plummet to something around like 35% approved of him, which is quite low. So Johnson shocks a lot of people by announcing that he will not run for a second term of office because things have become so divisive. He had become so unpopular. And there were multiple people that were already planning to challenge him within the Democratic Party for the nomination for president. So it cost him that point, the office of the presidency. Now, the war is going to continue for many more years, but after 1968, after the Tet Offensive, it is really, again, the perception of most Americans that the war is no longer winnable, and that's even the perception in kind of the place where military officials are operating from now. It is no longer an issue of how do we win this, but it becomes an issue of how do we get out of this? You know, how do we get out of this while saving face? How do we get out of this in a way that's not going to completely embarrass us and that's going to still try to support South Vietnam as best we can and try to prop up that government as best we can? So we'll continue to see that, and we won't see the United States completely get out of this until Nixon. Oops. What am I doing? Oh yeah. Hold on a second. Let me fix this. But okay. Kind of inappropriate video, apparently. Okay, so all this is happening, like I said, the year 1968, which was an incredibly traumatic year, and I think no one of all, you know, we best of all, I think, probably understand that more than a lot of folks. This year has been, I've heard comparisons made many times, perhaps you have, to 1968. This is about the closest thing we've gotten to everything that's gone on this year. But you know how we all are at this point. We're all like, you know, okay, alien invasion, I wouldn't be surprised. You know, what next kind of a thing. That's sort of where people were in 1968 for similar reasons. Presidential election, everything just seemed to be kind of falling apart to a lot of folks. So 1968 saw because of Vietnam and because of civil rights and because of other kinds of unrest. It was just an incredibly traumatic, turbulent year in which there was all kinds of protests, violence, from city to city. Starting, you have race riots going on and racial violence in certain cities, and that continuing division over the direction of the civil rights movement, that very militant black nationalism movement. You've got racial unrest going on there. You have all kinds of student activism all over college campuses that were active in protests against the war in favor of civil rights. There's just all kinds of political division and strife and people rioting in streets. Again, people just kind of looking around and going, what is going on? What has this world come to? Also, a couple of high profile assassinations, which further, lead to that trauma. It is in 1968 that Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis. And that leads to further some of those race riots. Some of that in itself provokes violence. And there's rioting in the days and weeks of King's assassination. And that puts, the future of the civil rights movement and the direction of the civil rights movement in extreme question. Also later that summer, Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, is assassinated. He's running for president. And he was assassinated as well. He was probably the front runner for the Democratic nomination before his assassination. So again, it's sort of like today as people kind of look around and just go, what is going on? How much more can this take? Very, very similar in 1968, and also an election year, just like 2020 was an election year. And this results in even further violence and further concern in the summer of 1968 when the Democratic Party meets in Chicago for their nominating convention. So, political parties have nominating conventions every 4 years to nominate their candidates. The Democrats in particular were very divided, not just over their nominee, but there was just all kinds of tension and all this protest and all that stuff just seemed to culminate at the Democratic convention because they're there to do all their business of nominating their candidate, but all these protesters show up, whether they were anti-war protesters or, protesting racial violence, any of those things. And all this rioting breaks out at the convention, both outside the convention and some of it actually happening inside the convention, and fights and the police getting called out. And all of this unfolding on national television. And back in these days, people watched these conventions on TV like it was a football game. One, it was one of the only things on. But two, in these days, you really did not know who was going to get the nomination until the convention. Nowadays that's, it's just formality. But everybody's watching this and they're seeing these riots and the police come out and there's tear gas and they're beating all these protesters with clubs and all this kind of stuff. Just another event of, what is happening. Just a complete, seems like a complete breakdown in law and order, a complete breakdown of society. And I want to show you some of that, but it's going to make me do it here because it says it's inappropriate. It's not that inappropriate. Oops.
Members of the Youth International Party, Yuppies, they call themselves, converged on Chicago. They said they were there to protest for war, poverty, racism, and other social ills. Some of them were also determined to provoke a confrontation, draw attention from the convention to the streets. Mayor Richard Daley vowed to keep it peaceful, even if it took force to keep the peace. He was backed by 12,000 police, 5,000 National Guardsmen, 7,500 regular army troops.
hundreds of marchers and dozens of policemen were injured. Restraint was out on both sides. This was later called a police riot. During that frightful week, the demonstrators repeatedly tried to march on the side of the convention, the stockyards. Repeatedly, they were forced back. But even inside the convention hall, the virus of violence was pervasive. Dan Rather, at Warner Plaza, of CBS News. Keep your hands off of me. Don't push me, please.
So even on the inside, they're shoving and hitting and all kind of stuff. It was just a mess. Okay. So let's take a look at how all that violence and all of that affected this election. Another interesting thing about the election, you also had in addition to, so the Democrats are going to nominate a guy named Hubert Humphrey as their candidate. We'll get to the Republicans in just a second. You also had an independent candidate, an American independent, this one time kind of a party thing. In 1968, George Wallace. Some of you may recognize the name George Wallace. He was former governor of Alabama. This is the guy that infamously stood in the door of the University of Alabama refusing to let African American students in, if you've heard that whole thing. A staunch segregationist. He tones down the racial rhetoric for his presidential bid, but kind of appeals to, a lot of white Southerners in particular that saw all of the violence and the unrest, in particular the radicalization of things, the radicalization of the civil rights movement, all of that. And while his candidacy was never, he was never going to win, he never had a shot to actually win, you'll notice that he did reasonably well for an independent candidate, for a non-major political party candidate. You notice right here, which states did he win in 1968? He won Deep South states, and that makes sense because although he's not necessarily running on a segregationist platform by this point, he certainly has that in his past and kind of appealing to those that were opposed to or nervous by a lot of the social unrest of the time and of the decade, and certainly of 1968. So the Democrats are going to nominate Hubert Humphrey. Republicans will nominate Richard Nixon. We saw Richard Nixon last, remember, running against Kennedy in 1960. He vowed he would not run for president again, but ultimately does in 1968. Nixon portrays himself and runs on this platform, certainly a comment on all of the turbulence of the whole decade, but certainly of 1968, running on this concept of law and order. We've heard this year a lot too. That, we've got to have law and order, certainly appealing to those folks that were very frightened by a lot of the violence that was taking place. And again, this was going on in multiple American cities where there were either race riots or some other kinds of violent protests taking place. So he tries to appeal and say, I will be a law and order president. We are going to have the rule of law. We're not going to riot in the streets. We are going to have some kind of semblance of normalcy. We're going to bring that back. So that's kind of his domestic line, which appeals, of course, to a lot of voters. Nixon refers to, and a lot of this term doesn't really get used to a little bit later, but he's appealing to what will later get called the silent majority. The silent majority refers to a, supposed majority, of course, of Americans that are not out in the protesting, that are not, involved in any of these movements, that are not out in the streets rioting and all of that. They are silent. They're not speaking out against these kinds of things. Basically saying the silent majority should rule. Those that are, that's the whole basis of the law and order thing. The silent majority doesn't want all of this. These people out in the streets causing riots and beating people and all this sort of stuff, that's the small minority of Americans. We need to divert the attention away from that. It's the silent majority does not support those kind of things, and that's what we're going to restore is the will of that silent majority to put law and order back in place and to have peace and to move forward without violence and to kind of put things back together. So Nixon, with that message of law and order, and because as you just saw, Democrats are literally tearing each other apart at this point, who do you suppose wins the election? Nixon does. So Nixon wins in 1968, which I think I put, yeah. So Nixon wins. It is rather close in the popular vote, but he has a pretty large electoral victory. And this begins actually a quite significant period of Republican dominance from this point. You've had mostly Democrats, except for Eisenhower up until now, ever since Roosevelt. So there's been kind of this Democratic dominant period, and this is going to enter in a sort of dominant period for Republicans. You'll see mostly Republicans in office, with the exception of Carter, for quite some time. And it's kind of this appeal to a more conservative America, a more, kind of moving away from the liberalism of the Great Society and the student protests and all those kind of things. So it's kind of signifying a bit of a political shift in that sense. So a very trying and difficult year results in Nixon being elected. He inherits the Vietnam conflict, so that's one of the things we'll look at in the next chapter, looking at how he eventually ends the Vietnam conflict, but not immediately, and other ways that he wants to try to roll back some Great Society reforms and things like that to try to sort of dismantle some of the structure of the federal government. Not a ton though, but that's what we're looking at by the end of the week and early next week. Okay, so questions on that much? All right, hold on.